Welcome to Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show.
All right. It is a fine day outside, Don.
It is.
What are we going to talk about today?
Well, today we're here to talk about one of my favorite new technologies in probably the past many years, and that is Realm. For those of you that aren't familiar with Realm, Realm is a database replacement for SQLite. We have a Realm Android engineer joining us today. Now, one quick thing before we get this thing going. I need to make a disclaimer to the listeners. I am currently consulting for Realm, and I have been since October of 2015 of last year. Neither our podcast, the Fragmented podcast, are getting paid for this interview or any coverage of Realm whatsoever. Realm is just a super interesting technology and something that I've personally been very interested in since I found out about it. I even mentioned it back in, I think, the Awesome Picks of episode number 4 way back in April of last year. Personally, I love the Realm as a product, and while I do love SQL for web products and I use it in Rails and all kinds of stuff like that, I have not always been a huge fan of SQLite on Android, and some might even go as far to say that I really kind of hate it sometimes. So I was an early adopter of DB4.0 and Neo4j, which attempted to store objects and all that kind of stuff, but neither felt just right. So Realm has kind of filled that void for me. Long story short, I love it. So anyway, after Kaushik and I watched Christian's talk over at Droidcon NYC last year, we both decided we'd love to get him on the show. I've been following Realm for a while, and I'm honored to be helping them out, and even more honored to have Christian from Realm join us on the show. Thanks for joining us, Christian.
So thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I remember your talk from Droidcon. It was amazing, and we immediately knew. And a whole bunch of listeners have also asked us about Realm. But at that point, I guess both Don and I didn't know too much about Realm. Obviously, that has changed a lot for Don.
Yeah.
Not so much for me. So we thought, why not just tip the scales and make sure we get you here, and then so everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, that sounds great. So hopefully I can answer some questions.
So Christian, why don't you start off by just giving us a little about your background? How did you get started?
Well, originally I was actually a web developer, like most people, I think, doing CMS systems in PHP and stuff. And then I moved to Android 5 years ago, and been there ever since, basically. I did the first 4 years as a consultant. There I basically saw some of the pains we have with SQLite. So, and when I got the chance to actually fix some of those, I basically grabbed it. So I've been at Realm for the last year or so, trying to make that experience a lot better, hopefully.
So Christian, you're not in the States, are you? Where are you located?
No, I'm living in Denmark, in Aarhus, which is the second largest city in Denmark. I'm working remotely from there. Our main Android office is in Copenhagen, in Denmark as well.
Oh, okay.
So that's 3 hours away. So, but most of the time I'm working from home, and then I'm 1 day a week at the office. So it's working out quite nicely, actually.
So let's dive in a little bit more into the history of Realm. So how did Realm start? Do you know?
So it actually started quite a few years before I joined. It was started by 2 guys from Denmark, Alexander and Bjarne, which worked at Nokia in the old days. So they worked on these old phones we all know and love, right?
Symbian OS, I remember.
Yeah. There they really experienced the difficulties of saving data on minimal devices that had no memory and no storage. So they really got to learn a lot about that. And then they saw an opportunity in mobile to actually make that better. So they took all that knowledge and put it into a new mobile database. So they joined Y Combinator in 2011. Basically they went into stealth mode for the first 3 years or so, actually building out the core technology. And then in 2014, during that summer, we released Objective-C, and Java was released in, I think, October the same year. So we have been in beta for a bit over a year at this point.
Very cool. I did not know about the Y Combinator beginnings, but I do remember in 2014 when it came up and it started blowing up. Everyone starting to use and had great things to say about Realm. So along the lines of the history, so how exactly does the business work then? I mean, you guys say you're open source and you're eventually planning to also open source the core database. So, I mean, is it a sort of Linux kind of model where if I use Realm, I want you guys to stay in business? I mean,
and do you have to pay for the
do users have to pay for using Realm, or how does that work? Is it free, or how does that operate?
Now, right now we're completely free, and we plan to stay that way, at least for the binding code that you have now. So the database code and the binding APIs you have right now, they will stay free. And then we plan to add like enterprise products on top of that. So most developers get it for free, and those that actually have special requirements, so they can pay for additional features and support and stuff like that. So that's basically the business.
And what exactly is your role at Realm? Like?
Well, we are still a pretty small team, right? So basically, I'm doing everything that's related to Android. So I'm doing API design, implementation, documentation, support, and coordinating with. We have a Coco team as well, so talking to them about features and stuff. So yeah, we are a small startup. So yeah, anything that's related to Android, basically.
So let's hop right into it. Can you tell us exactly what is Realm for listeners who are not familiar exactly with Realm? I mean, we did say it's an alternative to SQLite, but is it an ORM that sits on top of SQLite? Is it related to SQLite at all, or is it something completely different? Can you just kind of give us a rundown of what Realm is and why it's interesting?
Yeah, well, basically, Realm is a complete replacement for SQLite. So it's a completely new database technology. So yeah, SQLite is like a relational database, and that comes with a lot of problems with, at least on Android. So we thought we would give it like a new shot at it and provide something that's hopefully better. So we're not really an ORM, because that sort of implies that you're mapping to a relational database underneath the hood. So we are what is called an object database, which means that our fundamental data model is actually objects and not tables like it is in relational databases. So hopefully what we can provide is actually a much nicer API, because we don't have to do that weird mapping you do in ORMs. So that is our main focus, trying to make it as easy as possible for people to actually save data on mobile devices.
So do you guys use SQLite in any capacity?
No, not at all. So we look at what they do, of course, but it's not like we are building up on top of SQLite in any shape or form. So instead of trying to build yet another ORM on top of that, we actually replaced the underlying layer instead and fixed the problem there instead. So
does Realm in the background piggyback off SQLite or something, or no? Is it straight up? No. Is it a completely different thing?
No, we bring our own native code, so we don't use anything from SQLite at all. So.
Cool, that makes sense.
The data in traditional, SQL databases are stored in these tables and rows, and we have these like weird relationships all over the kind of place. And from what I'm hearing here and what I know about Realm, it's a little bit different. Can you explain how data is stored in Realm? I mean, is it similar to tables and rows, or is it objects, or how does that work?
So basically, we actually still store our objects in tables, but the main difference in Realm is that the relationships between the tables they're completely different, and that's the main thing. Is that in SQLite, right? You have these keys and foreign keys that sort of define the mapping and how you jump between tables. In Realm, which is an object database, those relationships are first-class citizens, which means that jumping between, like following this reference is actually free compared to SQLite, where you have to make a new query for it or make joins and stuff like that. That you don't have to do that in Realm. You can just follow these references for free, which pretty much mirrors what you have in Java already, right? So that's the main difference.
I think to clarify that, just so listeners understand, that means if we have an object that's like a person object, and that person object has a list of dog objects that, this person has many dogs. In traditional SQLite, we'd have to, do some type of join and look it up based upon primary keys and foreign keys and so forth. But with Realm, that's not necessary, because everything is native at that point. So if that's correct what you're saying, you can basically say person.getDogs, and that is a just quick native call. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
So now, Realm is Realm open source or what?
Well, partly it is. So Realm right now is two different products. We have the Realm core, which is like the core database, and then we have the bindings on top, which is the code that users interact with, and the binding code, which is written in Java and it's JNI code. That is completely open source. That's Apache 2 right now.
Okay.
Realm core itself is not open source yet. So we said from the start when we released it last year that we want to release it as open source under Apache 2 as well. But we want to finish the major features first and clean it up so it's ready for open source. So it's definitely on something we want to do, but it's not open source yet.
But Realm is not like in an alpha or beta state, right? Like we can start using Realm confidently and there's support at this point, right?
Yeah. So technically we're still in beta stage, but that's the underlying database is actually pretty stable. So it's the reason it's in beta is basically because we want to have the freedom to modify the APIs on top as easy as APIs as possible for users. And that might mean that we have to break things a few times until we get it right. So that's basically the only reason we're still in beta, is that we really want to figure out the best APIs possible, and then we move to a more stable release plan.
That is so interesting. I've never thought about that. So here the reason is not because of releasing intellectual property or anything. The whole point is you just want to make sure that it's stable, and then it gives you some flexibility while it's still closed source, so you can be a little more aggressive at changing your API.
Yeah, definitely. So you definitely shouldn't be afraid of losing data using Realm,
right?
Because the underlying database is rock solid, right? So yeah.
I remember reading on your folks' website. So does Realm do different platforms as well?
Yeah, so that's actually one of our main design principles, is that we really want to be a cross-platform database so that you can use the same data on both iOS and Android. So we go to pretty stretches to actually make some of the similar APIs on both iOS and Android. And then we're actually in private beta for C# for Xamarin right now. And we have a React Native JavaScript binding as well, which is also really soon in private beta. So we actually plan to release bindings for all the major languages so that you can actually use this technology across all the platforms you have.
This might seem a little crazy, but I'm trying to understand. You mentioned that one of the core objectives for Realm is to make sure that the underlying database is the same, and then you can have these different bindings in different platforms, so it can all essentially be massaged into the same into accepting the same database, right?
Yeah.
What exactly is the advantage? Does that mean I can actually share the actual code in some way in the future, possibly between iOS and Android? I'm trying to understand what's the drive there? Why do you feel this is a core objective?
The core objective is basically because quite often it actually runs on multiple platforms. Mm-hmm. So actually being able to distribute your data across those platforms without having to modify the data all the time is actually really beneficial. Mm-hmm. So that's the main driver, is that we see apps today. The main case we're trying to solve is basically to store your data offline, right? And online apps usually have apps for more than one platform. So if we can give them a data layer that actually works across those platforms, it will make app developers' jobs so much easier. But we don't strive to make a single language for them, because that will pretty much put us in the same category as SQLite, right? Just with another syntax. So we really want to stay as close to the platform languages as possible, because that ties into that ease of use. So because most people find SQL quite difficult to learn and use, because it's something completely different from what they're used to, right? So people that is probably listening to this podcast, most of them probably are familiar with SQL, and maybe some of them are really good at it, but there's a lot of developers that really, really don't like to work with SQL. So yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, knowing a technology doesn't necessarily always mean that we have to use it. If it's easier to get the job done faster through other means, I mean, obviously we should, in terms of developer productivity. I know Don is a big fan of always getting things done as fast and as quickly and efficiently as possible. So exactly. I'm sure he's on that side of the wagon. Quick follow-up on a previous thing you mentioned. Say I have an Android application and I have an iOS application. Say that I use Realm in both. What you're basically saying is, because each platform mirrors each other pretty closely, it just makes it easier for us to work with in terms of thinking about our model or data objects. So that's one of a big advantage.
Yeah. So that's a big advantage. And you can, if you are shipping your app with preloaded data, you can just generate that Realm file once on the server and just put it into both apps, and then you're done. You don't have to.
Okay.
So that's the main advantage. We also actually have a Realm browser. It just only works for Mac OS right now, mm-hmm. But there you can actually load a file Realm file and then generate the model code for both languages.
Very cool, very cool.
Yeah, so it's basically a quick start for other platforms, right? So if you write everything in Java, for example, and you want to move to iOS, then you just load the file in that browser and ask it to generate the model files. And then you actually have some code that actually can run on iOS and your.
That's awesome.
So let's maybe dive in a little into how Realm truly works, right? One question, you mentioned off the passing that we don't use SQLite at all if we sort of use Realm. So then the question is, how exactly is the data stored? So I know key value data stores are a big thing at this point, or at least they were last year. So do you folks use something very similar in the background? Or how is my data actually stored on the phone if it's not in SQLite?
It's actually stored in it's a column database, which gets quite technical, right? So,
yeah,
but it's a column database which has compared to SQLite, which is a row database. So it has some different trade-offs, and one of them is query speed. For example, is that we can execute queries much faster than a row database can, and we can read data much faster. So we are a bit slower at inserting those data. But that's one of the trade-offs we think is actually good for mobile. But we are basically everything is stored in B+ trees underneath the hood. So it's a big, giant tree structure, basically. But the mental model that we usually have on top of that is tables. So, and that's because we're not, even though we are a NoSQL database, we are not schema-less, so like a document database normally is, right? So these tables actually define the types, which means that you can't just insert any JSON blob into the database and navigate through that. You have to adhere to a certain schema. But that matches quite nicely with how you normally work with objects in the different languages, right? So it's not a big problem normally.
So you said that it's a column database, which I know does get very complicated, and then there's some concepts of tables, but it's also not schemaless. So as a developer, do developers need to worry about mapping to objects, or do they just get to work directly with objects? How does that work?
So the main idea is that you don't have to think about it. That's the main benefit of an object database, is that all those headaches you get from using an ORM, where you have these foreign collections you have to worry about, and when they load data and when they don't, that is completely gone in an object database. So you just look at your data as objects and you navigate them through the normal getters and setters, and forget about that that's actually a database underneath the hood, because everything works as you would expect it to. And you don't have these hidden performance costs all over the place. So
then I can basically just tell Realm to save this object that I have, and then I can also query for that object to get a list of people if I have person objects in there. Does that sound correct?
Yeah. So we're still an asset database, so we have transactional guarantees.
Okay.
So that means that you still have to write your data inside transactions, but you can read your data at any time. So it's not read and write transactions don't block each other. So yeah, which is slightly different from SQLite. So yeah.
Let's step through this a little. So say I want to store an object and a whole list of objects, right? How exactly does that work? Do you do all this in the background?
Yeah. So the way we work is that we have an annotation processor running. So when you create your entities in Java, you do that in Realm by extending this Realm object, which has an annotation on it. That actually triggers our annotation processor. And then we generate those proxy classes, which actually just overrides all the getters and setters and redirect all access to native code. So that means that when you are inserting a string, it just puts it into the database. And when you read a string, it reads it from the database. So that's just for the simple values. For objects, it's the same thing. So we just follow that pointer. So if you see, okay, you're inserting if you have an owner and dogs, and you want to insert that dog, you just say, okay, owner, get me your list of dogs, and it just jumps to that list, and you can insert that dog. So you don't have to do fancy queries and stuff, because that is handled automatically by Realm.
When you want to insert, can you do things like, person get list of children, or assuming Don has a new kid, person dot
no.
You add so you want to update that record. How does that work?
Yeah, so I think you can think of Realm as just like an object graph, just like you have in Java. So it's basically just creating the same objects you would in Java, except that all of these objects are realm objects. And as long as they are realm objects, things just work. So they just save automatically in the database. So you don't have to think about, how do I map this object to my SQL code, and how do I map it? How do I follow these links and stuff? All of that just happens automatically.
That, to me, that's when I saw the original documentation back in April of last year, and I saw that you just have these objects, and you extend realm object, and you have your strings, your ints, and your other relationships to other objects, and you can just tell realm to just save them, and then you can perform some queries to get them back out of realm. And I don't have to do any mapping. It literally blew my mind because I was able to I was creating an application, and I didn't have to focus on, all right, now I need to fire up SQLite. Now I need to make sure I'm creating my tables correctly. Oops, I messed up the SQL syntax to create the table. Oops, I messed up the query syntax or whatever. I had all this plumbing I had to do previously that was now gone when I used Realm. It was just like, all right, well, I need to store these list of, widgets inside of this database. Boom. Okay, they're stored. All of a sudden, I had a humongous problem that was kind of gone already. And that was a huge, powerful concept that I still love to this day.
So, but to be fair to ORMs, right, they offer the same flexibility of you working with objects. So I think where the main difference with Realm is that those references are the free ones, because in ORMs, they're definitely not free. They actually cost a lot, which means that people often model their data in this relational structure, which doesn't resemble what they actually want to do in the code. So they're going through all these hoops to actually make the data model fit SQLite instead of making the data model fit their domain model. So by using Realm, you don't have to do that. You just model your data as you want, and then it just works. So speaking of of getting the data out of Realm, I know that there's a nice, cool little query language that you guys have. Let's say I have a list of person objects. How do I get those person objects out of Realm so I can start working with them inside of my application? So yeah, basically we have because we're not a SQL database, we have our own query syntax, which is both a nice thing and a bad thing, because then of course people would have to learn this language. They can't just piggyback on their previous SQL knowledge. But yeah, basically you run a query, which is something like, okay, where some object equal to some ID and find first, and then you get that object out. So it's a semi-type safe language right now, which means that it's function based. So you get the nice autocomplete. We're not at the point yet where you can autocomplete like fields and stuff, because the annotation processor doesn't really allow that. But it's still like semi-automatic, which still improves the speed a lot, and you are saved from a lot of potential errors at least. So
I guess this is a good question too, because sometimes I'll have, like we had the example, we have a person class, and then that person class has a list of dogs. Is there a way for me to query the database for a person that has a dog who is the age of 7? Is that possible?
Yeah, that's actually possible. So object graph queries is a slightly different thing than SQL queries, because you have to think about it in a different way. And we definitely still have some work to do to actually flesh out these advanced queries, because you can really do some nifty stuff with graph queries. And we're still we still have like a basic query language, but those sort of queries definitely is possible. But we still have some features we would like to add to make it even more powerful. But so far it seems like we're covering most of the use cases.
Okay.
If I have to think in like the land of SQL, does this mean, for example, I want to find the intersection of all employees between two organizations that are of a particular gender and of a particular, like, are in a particular department or work in a field, right? If I want to like build something kind of complex with like these different kinds of joins, in the world of Realm, I would use the language that you specified to achieve this? Yeah.
So joins is a somewhat weird topic, because joins doesn't make sense in an object database, because joins is useful if you have these tables in a relation database in a way you combine those tables, and then you have left join and right join depending on what data you want. But in Realm, you basically query the object graph, and then you get all those objects out, and then you can jump around that graph. It's not in SQL. You're sort of selecting a subset of these fields on the object and saying, I only want the name and the age and the dog. In Realm, you get everything out, But because we lazy load every day, all the data, it doesn't matter actually. So actually getting those objects out is basically free because all you get is a pointer to the underlying data. It's not until you actually start reading them that you actually start loading data.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So I guess this is pretty similar to also like how Rails does like the ARL thing, right? Like you can build, what is it called? Active query or something, right? Until you actually hit like the query, like it actually just like caches the query and it keeps like constructing this query in the background. Because I mean, in the end, the relational stuff is not necessarily something that we have to worry technically, but if I did think as like a normal user, right, like it is pretty important, right? That's one of the biggest advantages of having a relational database. If I want to actually get meaningful data, right, there's definitely like there's an intersection that requires to happen. Like I have like this data blob A, data blob B, and I want to find the intersection of the two, right? So basically what you're saying is like you can construct the query, like the query is constructed where it actually does like all the complex joining order. Or, I mean, in this case, there doesn't necessarily have to be a join. But in the end, I get the hit only when I pull that data out. Like I say, hey, get me the data. That's when it pulls the data directly out.
Yeah. So, but it's actually a little more complicated than that because some queries are actually more easily expressed in SQL than they are in an object database. For example, those blob queries you talk about where you have two things that are not really connected at all. Those sort of queries are not really expressible in Realm because we sort of define those relationships when you insert the data. So of course you can then ask to get some objects out again, but you can't like say, okay, I want the person and only 5 of his dogs. You still get all 10 dogs, and then it's up to you to find, unless you of course query the other way around. So you say, okay, I just want to look at the dogs and then find those 5 that has this owner. So you have to think of querying a bit differently. So it's, you definitely have to, for those complex cases, you probably have to get used to thinking about querying in a different way. It takes some getting used to, of course.
You mentioned some time back that Realm is actually, it isn't schema-less. There is a specific schema, right? So one of the big advantages with schema-less databases is you don't have to deal with migrations whatsoever, right? Now, I don't completely understand because of this object model, like it doesn't seem like migrations would be a problem, but then you said it's also not necessarily schema-less. So like, how does that work? I mean, how does Realm deal with migrations?
Yeah, so if I need to add like a field to an object, what happens then?
So yeah, if you like decide, okay, I have this person, I want to add another field to him, you basically have to define a migration saying, okay, now my Java model changed from this state to this state. And that's because when you open a Realm, it actually checks your Java files to see if they match what is actually in the database. So we know that the Java files and the Realm work together. So you have to define these migrations to actually make sure that happens. But actually, there's a really great talk by Martin Fowler about the schemaless databases, because the concept of saying that schemaless databases doesn't require migrations isn't actually true. You just push that problem to the app developer. So of course the database guy gets the easy job because he's just saving blobs. But then you push that headache out to the apps that actually use the data, because then you have to figure out, okay, when is this data and the new data and the old data, and try to fix all these cases. If you do that through migrations, then you at least know there's only one place you have to do that.
When I looked at Realm previously, one of my biggest qualms with Realm is essentially because I have to extend a Realm object, that doesn't necessarily give me the flexibility of using POJOs, right? I'm a big fan of like unit testing and like POJO testing specifically, because then I don't have to deal with any framework whatsoever. How does that work with Realm? So if I have to, I mean, I'm guessing I would get the benefits of unit testing because Realm is like an independent library, and I don't necessarily think it has anything to do with the Android context. I would still be able to do POJO testing, right? I mean, is that true?
Yeah, that's true. So actually extending Realm object is still something we discuss quite a lot internally, because just like you, there's quite a few people that really dislike extending stuff on their POJOs. And basically the reason we do it right now is primarily for type safety, so that our API, you know that when you work with our API, you only work with objects that we can actually work with. So we are moving those runtime exceptions to compile time. Plus, we actually have the benefit of adding a lot of nice methods on this Realm object. Right now, we can, for example, convert a Realm object to an observable, an Rx observable. So this gives us this kind of flexibility. Of course, we could still do that by just having you implement an interface or something.
Right. Yeah.
But the API gets a lot more messy. But we actually still have an open issue on it in our GitHub. So if people have some arguments they want to put forth, we will definitely want to hear them, because we are still sort of debating what we want to do. Because some people definitely don't like what we're doing right now.
All right. So you mentioned these things called a proxy object, right? So this is essentially, so what exactly is a proxy object and what's the significance of it? So when I extend a realm object, as I would, like if I'm consuming the API, I make sure my model extends a realm object. And what exactly is this proxy object? Is it what's generated, like the underlying class file that's generated by the annotation processor?
Yeah, that's exactly true. So the proxy object is what you get out of. If you ask for an object from Realm, you're not getting your object out. You're getting this proxy object out, and the proxy object is just a placeholder for the underlying data. So one of the primary design goals from Realm is to be a zero copy database, and this of course gets even more technical. But basically, what it means is that your data is only stored in one place, and that has huge performance implications, because then you don't have to copy data around all the time. For example, if you look at how an ORM does it, you do a SQL query, which then copies its data into this cursor window, and then the ORM copies all the data from the cursor window up into the Java heap. So now you copied your data twice. In Realm, you just get a pointer to the actual data on disk. So they're only defined there, and then you only get them if you ask for them.
Oh, okay. So I totally misunderstood. When I saw it on the website, I thought it was very similar to like immutable sort of copies and stuff. So it doesn't change whatsoever. But, this is like something different altogether. This is basically saying there's only one single source of truth throughout your whole application.
Yep.
Yeah, that's exactly true. So, and that's actually one of the main benefits of Realm, as we see it, is that if you're working with this object graph, then you're always sure that you're working in this consistent state. So because your data is only stored one place, right? So if you're copying data out of whatever you're storing data in, then there's a quite a big chance of you actually suddenly having two copies, and which one is then true, and one of them gets out of date and stuff like that. So you remove a whole class of headaches by doing it this way.
So it sounds like there's like some level of bytecode weaving that has to happen in order to like make all the players perform their role. Is that true?
Actually not. Right now, we work purely by using annotation processing, but that's because we have quite strict requirements on our model objects right now. And that's actually one of the main headaches people have using Realm right now, is that we're only allowing you to have getters and setters on your objects, which is of course annoying if it's a domain object and you want to have rules that enforce something. By requiring you to only have getters and setters, we can basically override those with the annotation processor without worrying about it, and it will work. But we actually just pushed a pull request today where we are about to change that. So your objects can actually contain anything they like, even public fields, for example. And that means that we will actually modify the bytecode. So all this field access actually goes through the proper getters and setters. And that will actually lift all these requirements. So you can actually have an object that looks like a normal object, and it will still magically work. That's pretty cool.
There's a lot of moving parts in Realm just in the Java binding, and it looks like there's a fairly significant test suite that you guys have set up. How do you guys go about testing everything in Realm?
We are fortunate that it's just an SDK, right? So we don't have that many UI components we have to test. We are pretty thorough with our unit test. I think we're somewhere around thousands or more right now. And so we are running unit tests on basically all the public API and trying to run that because we're using native code. And we've seen some really funky bugs on different devices because of that. So we are really trying to run on a different set of architectures and stuff like that. So yeah, but it's mostly unit tests, and then we have some example projects we run through the default monkey tester that's come with the Android SDK, just to make sure that we actually have some sort of integration test running as well.
The monkey test runner is the one where you let it go all crazy on an application that you develop, right?
Yeah, so it basically puts 2,000 events or so through our small test applications, and because these small test apps are basically just 1 or 2 page apps, you're pretty sure that it will cover everything. So it's not like there's something that's hidden behind logins and stuff. So it's actually a quite good way to catch some weird stuff sometimes. So.
And so your recommendation for those who use Realm and want to maybe write more tests is essentially to go the unit test route, at least for the model layer.
Yeah, definitely. So our Realm objects, they can actually be instantiated like normal Java objects. So you can actually just use them as normal objects in your unit tests if you want to. So touching the actual Realm code, that's like doing queries and stuff, that has to hit the native code. So that doesn't actually work right now with the JUnit 4 stuff. So you have to actually use instrumentation test for that to work because it has to run on the device.
Okay.
Which is a bit annoying. But in most architectures, this is sort of hidden away in some layer anyway. So it's normally not a big problem, but it's still a bit annoying. So we hope to fix at some point, if possible.
One of the things that I noticed about Realm that initially I actually had no idea about was that it's actually reactive in nature. And some people are going to immediately think RX, and we can talk about that in a minute, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I mean by that is Realm has the concept of auto-updating objects and auto-updating like Realm results. And for the listeners that aren't familiar with this, it basically means that if you've performed a query and you've received a person object back, or you've received a list of person objects back, if it, for any reason somebody adds another, maybe another thread adds another person to the database, that original query result is automatically updated in near real time, based upon the next execution of the Android looper. And the same goes for the object. If you just have a single person object and someone changes the name elsewhere, it'll be updated in that object in your other thread automatically. So I don't have to refetch my objects to know that they're updated. I can then respond to it based upon these notifications that Realm has. It says, hey, your list is updated, or your object is updated, or hey, the Realm's data has changed in itself. When I learned that, it was super powerful because then I could basically just react to when my data changed. I didn't have to always pull the database to figure it out. That does also kind of bring up the elephant in the room with Realm, and that's the threading situation. How does Realm work with threads? Can you walk us through a little bit of that, Christian?
Yeah, sure. So I guess what you're talking about is that all the Realm objects right now is what is called thread confined, which means that they can only live on one thread. And if you try to access it on another thread, it basically blows up and says you can't do that. And that's, of course, annoying if you're moving across different worker threads doing stuff. But it's extremely powerful if you're, for example, on the UI thread, because that means that if you have an object, you can just jump around in the object graph and you know that everything is actually, it's consistent. You don't have with, for example, with SQLite, where you have to, if something changes, you normally trigger these content observer stuff, and then you have to load it again, and then when it's all done loading and stuff like that. In here, once you actually get a notification back, you know that all your objects, because we're just pointing to the data one place in Realm, you know that everything is actually up to date. So you can just reuse all your objects. You don't have to refetch them. You can just keep using them once you get this change notification back. So it saves you a lot of headaches regarding thinking about when is my data actually up to date and what should I do in the meantime while it's loading data. In Realm, once you get this notification back saying now it's up to date, it actually means that all your data is up to date on that thread. That is basically what we're trying. That's why there is a thread confinement right now, is that this consistency guarantee is quite hard to maintain across threads. We're still looking at it because, for example, RxJava does solve this problem completely different. So which is sort of doesn't really work well with how Realm thinks about thread safety. So it's sort of two different paradigms, but we definitely hope to support both.
So here's the question then, right? You mentioned there's like thread confinement. Is it confined to the UI thread then? Because in general, like as Android developers, we have been trained like from the beginning not to do any operation that takes like a significant amount of time on the main thread, right? So that basically, and any IO operation, like the rule of thumb is an IO operation by that guarantee should be confined to any other thread other than the UI thread, right? So how do we make sense of that? Can we confine all of Realm's work to an independent IO thread? Can we specify an IO thread and say, hey, run only on this thread? And so that way we still satisfy the guarantee that you mentioned here for the thread confinement?
Yeah, Yeah, sure. So one of the reasons we have thread confinement is that if we allow people to do this by themselves, we have no control over which version of your data exists on both threads, which makes it hard to think about this consistency.
Right.
But what we do, we actually, I think it was 6 months ago, we implemented this async API, which means that now you have async methods for all the querying stuff and writing write transactions. And that using that, we actually use our own worker thread. And because we control that thread, we know exactly what happens when we transfer data between it. So that means that you can actually, on the UI thread, say, I want to do this async query, and then you can notify me when it's done. And then we will make sure that the data you get back is actually consistent with what you already have on that thread. So we actually have solutions for this that uses our own APIs. So yeah, you can definitely come around this thread confinement by using these async APIs.
As we say, kids, concurrency and thread handling, these are some of the most difficult problems in computer science. So
Yep.
Yeah.
we have the folks at Realm hammering at that problem.
Now, I know there's a couple of shortcomings with Realm, and some people think that the threading thing is a shortcoming. And we've already talked about that, but it's also very powerful with the reactive stuff that you guys have and the async API that solves a lot of those problems. One of the shortcomings that I have found when talking to other developers about Realm is that it's just kind of a different paradigm. And as Kaushik said, like you don't get to, or I think you've said it, Christian, you don't get to leverage your existing SQL knowledge, and you kind of have to learn something new. So it's a different paradigm. And because of this different reactive nature, that Realm has a lot of things can be happening that you may or may not expect, like the live auto-updating results and the auto-updating objects. You kind of have to think a little bit differently than you traditionally do. I've also noticed that there is a lack of composite primary key support. Now, this list isn't a large list. Is there any other things that the listeners should know about that they might consider shortcomings of Realm?
Well, the primary thing we're hearing is this object stuff about you not being able to implement your own methods in Realm objects. Mm-hmm. So that's probably the biggest one, and we are hopefully fixing that in the next release. But yeah, but apart from that, I think actually educating people about how the threading works and how these live objects work, and that you are actually not having a copy of your data, you're having a pointer to the actual data, is probably where we are lacking the most, is that people really have to grasp these concepts before, otherwise they run into some weird situations where they're wondering what the hell is happening, right? So, of course, we can still, our query language is still limited in some situations, and we're definitely working on that as well. But
all right. So that was a power-packed episode. My mind is still a little blown, and I have a whole bunch of questions. So I'm sure folks can reach out to Christian if they have any questions specifically on Realm usage in Android. Thank you so much for being on the show, Christian. If our listeners want to reach out to you, what's the best way they can do that?
So that's probably Twitter. I'm at ChrMelchior.
Christian, does Realm have a Twitter handle or something? So if folks have questions on Realm, what would be a good way?
Sure. It's at Realm, so pretty straightforward.
Cool. Don, if people want to reach out to you, how would they do that?
They go on Twitter at Don Felker or my website, donfelker.com.
If folks want to reach me, I'm Kaushik Gopal on Twitter. That's KAUSHIKGOPAL. Thank you all for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.